Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our very first online summer school. For those of you who have attended courses in the last 2 weeks, I just want to thank you once again for your patience in dealing with our teething problems. We've all been on a tough learning curve this last year, learning how to do things in a different way, in a different world. Nevertheless, it is my great pleasure and honor this afternoon to introduce to you Abbas Jamie, who's going to talk about, sorry, I'm just being distracted by all these admissions. Abbas has more than 30 years experience across government and the private sector, and he's been involved in a broad range of industries, from setting up startup businesses to working for a New York Stock Exchange listed company. He has a broad range of qualifications across engineering, business, future studies, design thinking, and project management. He's a sought-after speaker on innovation, and he also holds a position of Community Liaison Africa for the World Design Organization. He's currently co-creating the future with UCT, the Western Cape Provincial Government, and the APRM at the African Union. So let us, without further ado, hand you over to Abbas's capable hands. Over to you, Abbas.
Thanks, Zuleika. Thanks for the lovely introduction and welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to go to the chat section. Maybe just people can just post where they calling in from, where you're sitting in South Africa, so I can get an idea of the audience. Yeah, so you can use the chat function for that. Today we're going to be speaking about this. Some people call it these skills of the future. We're talking about future studies. We talk about innovation, complexity. I think these are all things that people grapple with, and I think specifically with COVID now, we've seen a rise of that. People just been very unsure about the future, and I see there's one person from San Diego, Robinson. Welcome. So this talk is going to, this lecture is going to be an introduction to some of those skills of the future. And what I'm going to be doing on day one is just doing some introduction to these different fields that's out there. And the intention is not to make everyone futurists or complexity scientists or design thinkers, but basically to let people know that these fields are out there. And I'm going to show you how we are using them at the moment. So we'll be going through the first day, talking about these different fields, and then showing you a little bit of a case study in an organization that I did it with in private sector. So that's the first day. Tomorrow we'll be looking a little bit more at the actual tools, taking you through some of the tools that we use. There's also an exciting product that UCT, specifically the summer school, is going to be launching within the next few weeks around an online complexity course that you'll be able to do. So I'll be taking you through that as well, but then also touching on case studies, specifically in a South African context, government clients, as well as UCT. So, those people who have an affiliation to UCT, you'll be able to see the journey that UCT is on, which is quite an exciting journey as well. So that's the intention of this course today. Introduction, a little case study from corporate, and then tomorrow we'll do some of the tools as well as the case study on government and UCT specifically. So before I start the presentation, is there any questions? I see there's someone from France as well, and someone from Durbanville. 2 people from Durbanville. Anyone want to share anything? Any questions? That you specifically would like out of this course? I'm not sure, Zuleika, if people can unmute and talk, or is that are they allowed to? Do they have access?
What to you? Sorry, Annie. Sorry, I forgot to tell you that it's up to you how you want to conduct the course. Some lecturers prefer the questions to be at the end. Others don't mind being interrupted. But I think you've asked something very different. You're not sort of asking a question around the content. You're asking So it's fine if you want to, yeah, it's up to you really. So they
Okay.
can unmute themselves if you're asking them.
Unblock people so they can unmute and speak if they want. So yeah, if there are anything that anyone wants, would like me specifically to focus on, or anything specifically that you'd like to hear over the next two lectures, you can just let me know before I start the formal presentation. Anyone? No? Okay, let me get going with the presentation. Okay, I won't be able to see the chat now that I'm presenting, so if anything does come in on the chat, so later you can just capture that, all answers, please. I hope I'm on my first slide. So later you can just confirm. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yes, yes, you are.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks. So the topic for the lecture series is creating a desirable future. And what we're going to be doing today is talking a little about the futures. We'll talk a little about complexity. We'll delve a little bit into the design thinking. And then talk about Oricon, which is a large multinational engineering consulting company. So that's for today. Then tomorrow we'll start talking about what disruption means to us when you start talking about the future. We'll go through some of the tools, and then we'll do the two case studies, one with provincial government department and one with UCT specifically. So when we talk about the times that we're currently living in, I think there's again a lot of uncertainty, and people are questioning, what is this new norm, this post-COVID world, what is it going to look like? And so this whole field of future studies has been thrown into the spotlight, and people are questioning, how come futurists didn't pick this up? Well, in fact, they did. A lot of futurists, specifically people that focus in the health space, did talk about this sort of global pandemic possibility. And so in future studies, the first thing you need to understand is that as futurists, we don't predict the future. You cannot predict the future, but you can be part of shaping a better future. And so futurists talk about these different type of scenarios out there, and they do a lot of scenario planning. South Africa as a country has done some scenario planning. And then you look at a couple of those scenarios out there, and then you say, okay, so which one do you want to be part of creating? So that is sort of an introduction into this field of futures. And it's a very important principle, because people think that futurists are there to predict the future. So we don't predict the future. We talk about possible futures, and we always use the plural, because there's always more than one future. So however, in this futures field, we've got this thing that we call this futures dilemma. And people who have been in industries and have experience working, you'll know that we make decisions in the present. And those decisions are normally based on data from the past. But then very interestingly, we're making decisions in the present based on data from the past, but it's for a future that we've not yet visited. So that becomes quite an interesting concept if you look at it like this. We talk about things like getting back to basics. You can't get back to basics, because that past that you're talking about is gone. And so the current that we live in and the future that we're moving towards, you can never replicate what happened in the past. You can learn from the past, but you can't basically replicate that. And so this is this future dilemma that in most cases, and I've been in private sector, when you put your budgets together for the next year, you make a call and say, yeah, I think we're going to be, if it's a good year, we'll maybe make a 10% growth on last year's target. And so we take last year's target, just add 10% on that, and that's the target for next year. If you're not feeling that bullish, maybe it's 5%. And so this is the sort of backward-looking approach to the future, which is very problematic. And so when you do that, you just constantly create the past that you've come from. And so in future studies, we're saying that when you're talking about strategy specifically and looking at where you're going, you need to make futures that have this futures-based approach. And so you need to make decisions for the future, and it need to be based on the future. And so when I say based on the future, what does that mean? So in future studies, we ask, what is possible? And so if I say, is it possible, or it is possible, that Eskom sorts out all the electricity issues and we'll never have load shedding again? That is a possibility. But then we need to ask ourselves, how probable is that? And, you know, when it comes to that, then you can start looking at data and start doing these scenario planning. So we talk about this explorative futures and we talk about this normative futures. And then you get to this future that you want to create. And so it sounds quite simple, and you think that most organizations should be doing it. But we find that most organizations just don't. You know, they look at their numbers for the year past and they base it on that. And so there's very little of this sort of explorative and normative futures happening specifically in big organizations. And so this future that we talk about, there's lots of talk around the fourth industrial revolution as well, and you know, what is this thing? And so the fourth industrial revolution is a bit different to the other industrial revolution. The first one was all around the steam-based machines, and how the steam-based machines were helping with production. The second industrial revolution was around electricity and energy-based and mass production. And then the third industrial revolution was all around the computers and the internet and technology. And so those things were driving these revolutions. In this fourth industrial revolution, however, we find that it's not just one thing that's driving it. It is a whole lot of things that's taking place, you know, from big data analytics to artificial intelligence to this blockchain. All of these things are happening at the same time. And so we see this convergence and confluence of things that can shape the future. And so that's why it's so very difficult for people to define this fourth industrial revolution. And you know, as many people as you have in the room, you'll have definitions of what this fourth industrial revolution is. And so when we look at all of these things, and I've just put up a few of them here, each of these items on their own can dramatically change the world. And so when you bring them all together, it's just, you don't know where to start. So if I choose any one of them, let's just say renewable energy, solar, the solar energy, solar panels. And so when we look at the technologies out there, and when you bring technology onto a product, it starts, the capacity of this product just doubles up every year, and it hits what you call Moore's curve, and Moore's curve basically is exponential growth of things. And so we've seen the Moore's curve with a lot of technology products, with computers, with mobile phones, and now even with solar panels. And what that means is that almost every year you have the power capacity of a solar panel just doubling up, and the cost is starting to come down. And this is not unique to solar panels. You see it whenever technology converges onto a product. And so there's a university in the States that focuses on this exponential growth, Singularity University, and they've done lots of studies with different products, and they've looked at the solar panels, and they're saying at the rate that the solar panels are developing at this stage, there'll be enough solar capacity to power the whole world in 12 years' time. And the cost will be almost zero, because the cost just drops dramatically. And so we talk about moving towards a world where energy will potentially be free. And we're not talking decades' time, we're talking 12 years. And they've been pretty accurate with a lot of the forecasts they've done on mobile phones, on computers, etc. And yet, you know, we sit with this massive problem of Eskom as an example. And we're going to spend billions on trying to fix Eskom, and potentially in 12 years' time, you've got enough free energy. And so we as humans really struggle to comprehend this exponential growth. And likewise, for each of these diagrams here on the slide, you know, I can give a similar story of how these things can dramatically disrupt our world. And so this becomes very complex, and it's what we call the wicked problem, which brings us to this field of complexity. And when we talk about complexity, we say, you know, the first law of complexity says that when you have a complex problem, there's a simple and clear answer that's completely wrong. Because we often fall into that trap of saying, oh, if government just does this or someone just does this, then it will, it will be sorted out. And when it comes with complexity, there is no simple answer for these things. And so the first thing to realize is that when you're talking about the future, you're talking about a complex or wicked problem. And so when you deal with complex and wicked problems, what you need to remember is that you need to view it through these lenses, these different lenses. I come from an engineering background, and so engineers love jump into the technical solution. And so you need to pull yourself back from that and view it through different lenses. And these wicked complex problems, I'll show you some examples of that. In many cases, people say, oh, if this technology was just, if we had this app, or if government could just do this, it would sort of that, and it never works that way. And so when you're dealing with the complexity and the futures, view it through these different lenses. Secondly, you need to view it in the context that where we are staying. And so in the South African context, we've got the National Development Plan, a document for what South Africa can look like in the future. At the continental level, we have AU 2063, which talks about what the continent can look like, and then at the global level, the Sustainable Development Goals. So in whichever field you find yourself, these documents speak to a broad range of fields, whether it's energy, water, healthcare, these documents cover that. And so when you frame your future in a specific field, you use these documents as your framework, because it just makes it so much easier when you're engaging with politicians or stakeholders who have already bought into these massive framework documents. So that's the first thing you need to do, view it through different lenses, and secondly, frame yourself in the context where you find yourself. For those people in Cape Town or been in Cape Town for the last few years, would have lived through this day zero. Day zero was the day that Cape Town was going to run out of water. You open the taps and there's no more water. And this is a typical example of a complex, wicked problem. And this wasn't a technical problem. I was involved with Oricon, an engineering company, was quite close to the numbers, the technical numbers, and it wasn't a technical issue. And the city of Cape Town went down this route of campaigning for this day zero concept, and yes, they reduced the water usage in Cape Town into manageable levels. But through that process, what happened was that they lost the trust of the citizens of Cape Town. I've done this talk many times, and I've asked people in the audience, who trusts the city of Cape Town with regard to water, and I can't get one person to put their hands up. And so this is a outcome when you deal with a complex issue and you view it through a specific lens. There's unintended consequences, and unintended consequences of the Day Zero campaign that the city of Cape Town ran was this thing of losing trust with the citizens of Cape Town. And so be cautious about when you deal with complex problems of tackling it just through one lens. But then again, in South Africa, we have many other complex, wicked problems like the education, the health sector as well. And we're currently living through COVID, so I just thought that this would be a really good example to bring home this feel of complexity and why it's so important to view things through different lenses. So this came from a website called Visual Capitalist, and they do some they take data, big data, and they put it into visual format, and so it's a really nice website if you're interested in following data at a global level. And so they ran this article in March 2020 where they compared the Global Health Security Index with the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases. And from this graphic, it was done in March, they said there seemed to be a very close correlation between the Global Health Security Index and COVID cases. And so the outcome was that if you have a high Global Health Security Index, which is the ability of a country to deal with big health issues like a pandemic. And they were saying if you've got a high Global Health Security Index, it seems that you'll be able to deal with the virus, with COVID, much better. If we fast forward 3 months from March 2020 to June 2020, we see the US and the UK, which had the highest Global Health Security Index, also had the highest number of deaths in their country per 100,000. And so we see absolutely no correlation between the Global Health Security Index and how those countries were able to deal with the pandemic. So from a technical lens, they had all the health facilities in place, they had the expertise, they had the capacity, everything to deal with this. And yet we now know that they didn't deal with it well, and a lot of it has to do with politics and social issues. And I think specifically in the case of the US, you know, they've ended up with that because of politics. And so this is a very good example of when you're dealing with complex problems and you only view it through a technical lens, people die. You know, and that's what happens. And so it's critical that yourself, when you find yourself in these situations of complexity, view things through different lenses. And so when you're talking about complexity, it is about moving your thinking from a purely analytical thinking, and I'm an engineer, so we are analytical thinkers, but moving from analytical thinker to a systems thinking. And so as engineers, when the client says, I need a bridge, you know, we'll say, well, it's a steel bridge or concrete bridge, because we can design both of those things. Very seldom do we as engineers ask, why do you want the bridge? And so this systemic thinking brings us to this whole field of design thinking. And I'm not sure how many people have been exposed to design thinking, but design thinking comes from the industrial design world. And industrial designers are people that design things, everything that you touch and see and interact with, the chair you're sitting on, the pen you write with. And so when they design this thing that you need to interact with, they put the human at the center of it, because it's a human that must interact with it. And so the whole industrial design field is built around this concept of human centricity. And then this company called IDEO took this concept of human centricity and said, can we take this and put it into organizations? Can we bring this concept of human centricity into organizations? And they've become sort of almost the thought leaders, or definitely the thought leaders from a design thinking perspective, and have been leading this field for the last few years. And so we see a number of organizations have started to embrace this concept of design thinking, both private sector as well as academia and government are using design thinking to say, how do they make the organizations better? How do they make the organizations more human-centric and citizen-centric? And so when you ask these organizations, you know, what does design thinking mean to them? You get these sort of answers. It's about co-creating the future. It's a systematic approach to solving wicked problems. It's a space for creativity to flourish. It's about empathy, invention, iteration, and it unlocks innovation. And so when you talk about the future, in most cases, it should be in all cases, when you're talking about the future, we're talking about a better future. And so if we want to have a better future, we need to embrace this concept of innovation, of doing things differently in order to achieve this different future. And so, you know, innovation is not driven from a technology perspective, but more about what is the culture of your organization. How do you create this innovative culture in your organization that people are constantly looking at new ways of doing things, improving efficiencies, and being part of creating this new future. And so if you want that innovation culture in your organization, then creativity and exploration becomes a key building block. It's not good enough just to have a few people in the office saying they're the innovation team. You actually need to embed this creativity and this exploration culture into your organization. And so again, for those people who are still in corporate or in government, you know, you need to ask yourself, how creative is the environment you're currently sitting in? Because when you start talking about creating this future, we often say, you know, you need to think outside of the box. But thinking outside of the box means you need to engage with people outside of your box. And so myself as a technical person, hardcore engineering environment, you know, if I look sort of outside of my box, these are the people that's outside of my box. You know, it's the storytellers, the musicians, the artists, and how well does our industry as engineers engage with these people? Not very well, other than sponsoring an artist or something, but it's not embedded into organizations, the whole concept of creativity. And so when we talk about innovation, we talk about design thinking, we say there's these two very different worlds. There's the world that sort of most corporates live in, which is part of the STEM world, science, technology, engineering, and maths, and it's a hardcore technical world. And then you've got this whole creative world. And what we're saying is, if you want to really innovate, if you can bring those two worlds together, there's a sweet spot where innovation can really flourish. And what design thinking does, it allows you, it helps you to find that sweet spot in your organization. And so we talk about by innovation by design. And so design thinking is not the silver bullet for everything. It's not going to solve all your problems, but what it does do, it allows you to bring creativity into your organization in some sort of structured way. If there are real true creatives here sitting on this call today, the true creatives say, oh my God, here's engineers trying to put structure to creativity. But at the end of the day, organizations are structured, so you need to deliver certain products or services, and so you need some sort of structure, and that's what design thinking does quite well. It allows you to bring this creativity in a structured way. It allows you to bring this human-centric, this empathy into your organization. And what people that have been studying in this field, what they found out is that the complexity is growing at a rapid rate, and this rate of change, and design-led organizations are seems to be able to respond to that change much better than organizations that have not embraced it. And for the finance people in the room, this organization, Design Management Institute, they did a study over about a 10-year period to track companies that have embraced design thinking against companies that have not, and they use a number of well, in this case, they use the S&P 500. And what they found was that companies that had embraced design thinking had outperformed the competition by more than 200%. And so, when you talk about design thinking, some people will say, oh, here's another fad. They just see a lot of sticky notes and stuff in workshops, what is this about? But I think the numbers speaks for itself once you start doing the proper research and finding out, what is happening to organizations that have actually embraced design thinking. And if you Google design thinking, you will find a whole lot of resources and information. But the basic principles of design thinking starts with this empathy. How do you create empathy for your end user and putting yourself in the shoes of the end user, and then defining, making sure that you're actually asking the right question and you're solving for the right problem. Because like I said, as engineers, we tend to jump to our technical solution very quickly without asking, are we actually solving the right problem? And then the ideating, again, this whole concept of coming up with ideas, not by yourself as the technical person sitting in a room speaking to another technical person, but actually bringing in ideas from a broad range of people, including the end users. And so ideating with people, and in government, we talk about this concept of moving from designing for people to designing with people, and then design by the people. And so it is this concept of ideating beyond just your specifically silo-based area that you operate in. And then this whole concept of prototyping, where again, the concept of when you have an idea, get it 110% ready before you take it to market. The design thinking says, no, as soon as you have an idea, prototype it as quickly as possible. Prototype it in the form that you can take to the end user and show them, does this work for you? Does it speak to you? And so this concept of prototyping and failing fairly quickly and testing things. So that's basically the design thinking wave. And like I say, if you Google design thinking, you'll find a lot of information out there, lots of different tools, and I'll take you through some of them tomorrow as well. But we always remind people, for us, when we talk about design thinking, it's not about the tools. The tools are there just to support, but ultimately what you're talking about is creating this culture of having deep empathy for people. And I think if anything, this COVID has shown us that, empathy is what the world desperately needs right now. Even with the vaccine rollout, we've seen that, countries that can afford to do it, and first world countries that have the money have bought up to 7, 8, 9 times more doses than they actually need. And that has left the rest of the world scrambling to take up the doses that's left. And so you see very little empathy when it comes to these sort of things at this point in time. It's about all people just taking care of themselves. And if if that is the approach and methodology with the vaccine, any resource in the future that's going to be limited, we know how countries are going to respond, because we've seen how they've responded to this problem. And it's extremely short-sighted, because the world, as we know, can't operate if everyone is not safe. But yet people are buying 9 times the amount of doses they need for the citizens of their country. And so for me, innovation is never about the technology. Innovation is about creating a different future, a better future that is deeply human-centered, and bringing that culture into organizations. And so the organizations that I work with, both in academia and government, it is about saying, how do we place the citizen at the center of everything we do? And it's not about just building more schools and more roads and more hospitals, but actually saying, embed this culture of empathy into the organization. Because if we can do that, we can then move towards a more desirable future that we can all be part of, and that we want to create. So that's a sort of introduction just to those concepts around futures, complexity, and design thinking. I'm just going to show you some of the work that we did at Oricon. For those people who don't know, Oricon is a large multinational engineering consulting business. About 7,000 engineers, about 2,000 in Africa. And they embarked, and I was part of this organization in 2016, and we embarked on this strategy to bring design thinking into our organization. And so the question is, how do you get 7,000 engineers to think like creative designers? And the CEO at the time, who used to be the CEO of Deloitte, he joined Oricon, and he came up with this concept of bringing this design thinking into the organization. And he always said, he's not going to stand on the table and sing and dance, but there are 2 ways of being creative. One can sing and dance, or one can create an environment in which singers and dancers can flourish. And I think that's what he managed to do fairly well. He created the space for people to experiment. And so within Oricon, in the African context, I was given the responsibility for driving out the design thinking and the innovation in an African context. So I'll share with you with some of the things that we did. So one of the first things that the organization did was launch this design academy, which was picking up the best engineers in the organization and then taking them on this aggressive training over 1 year, which included lots of creativity, included storytelling, and bringing in world experts in these fields to enhance the core engineering skills with these other creative skills. And this thing has been running now for 4 years, and the engineers that have come through this academy has just lifted the game to a completely different level. One of the other things the organization did was launch this blog called Just Imagine. And so every 2 weeks, a blog comes out, and this is written by the staff within the organization. So people would come up with ideas about the future and write up these articles. They get support from a storyteller, and then this blog goes out. And this blog has received quite a lot of following, because it's not something that you would normally expect in the engineering world. The engineers are very much focused on the technical things, and here you had the staff becoming storytellers, becoming creators of the future and shapers of the future. And so it was this Just Imagine became a great success for the company. And so these things started embedding into the organization, and you saw this change taking place within the organization, where documentation changed as well. And so traditional document, one on the left, would be what the organization does, and it moved completely to this new thing. And this was a project in Australia where the head office is, where it was for the massive theatre redevelopment, and the company won this project, even though it was not the lowest. But it won it because before the engineers drew the first line on the page for this bid document, They went to run workshops with the actual people that use the theatre, the actual dancers, the musicians, and they embedded themselves into that world and understood what artists actually want from a facility. And so by the time the bid went in, the adjudicators were just blown away because there was this deep, deep understanding of the end users, and the development that was therefore put forward spoke so well to what the artists wanted that the adjudicators could not ignore the bid. And so you see this massive shift of not only what a document looks like, but how you approach documents as well, not from a technical perspective at all, but from a humane perspective, from this empathy perspective. And then this change started filtering throughout the organization, even into the support services. And we see the HR department then took on what does creativity and innovation mean to them. And if you join Oricon now, both here in South Africa or in Australia, your HR contract is this cartoon. And this is accepted by government as a legal binding document, but the 4,000 word document is gone and it's in this cartoon format. And so these changes we've been driven across the organization, and space being created for people to experiment and do things. Here in Africa, we also took on the opportunity to do things differently, and this was one project that we were driving in Nairobi. It was part of the Nairobi Innovation Week. And again, people were expecting, the companies like Oricon to come there with technology and drones because it's an innovation week. But we came there with this concept of bringing this design thinking to this innovation week. And for those people who have been to Nairobi, it's a beautiful city with a river running through it, and the city got its name from the Nairobi River. And but it's very polluted in many parts of the city. And we did this design workshop with the University of Nairobi, where we pulled students in to be part of a strat session with the city. And initially, when the students walked in, it was, well, the city must just clean up the river. And after taking them through a design methodology, at the end of the workshop, it was a few days when they left with a completely different mindset. They left with a mindset that basically said that the river is ours, we need to own the river, we need to make solutions for this problem. It wasn't about someone else taking ownership of things. And this is one of the things that design thinking does extremely well. It allows you to engage with end users and citizens so that people can take ownership of solutions, and take ownership of the future, and that they are part of the solution and not seen as some professional bringing them some solution. And we were able to do that over a few days, completely change the mindset of these young people. And this project was then taken on in Nairobi further as well. So that was by the riverside. And one of the things that came out of this project, which was really wonderful, was that it got the name By the River from through the workshops. When a normal way of approaching these river problems would be for the engineering company to go in and look at the water quality, then come up with a technical specification for the solution and give that specification over to the client. In this case, we said, well, what is the role of rivers in Africa, and do rivers play a role in shaping who we are as Africans? And we came with this term By the Riverside. It's a term that came out in Nairobi, that previously, when you had a big announcement to make, you would go down to the river to make that announcement. And the river was a very special place for special occasions. We also found that the tribes, traditions along the rivers, they crossed colonial boundaries without seeing it. And so we see that the rivers play a significant role in shaping who we are as Africans. And so we said, if we can tell the story of the river, you tell the story of who you are as an African. And so if you tell that story of who you are as an African, then you can start talking about, because now the person's taken ownership of that, now you can start talking about technical solutions to help the person take ownership of the river. And so that whole methodology landed extremely well at the Nairobi Innovation Week. Another project that I want to share with you was by a local photographer, Cape Town photographer called Yasser Bully. And this guy's a brilliant photographer, and he has his ability to capture the emotions of people regardless of their physical environment. And we engaged with him at the Open Design Festival in Cape Town. And he told me that he was doing this public transport trip from Cape Town to Dar es Salaam. And I said, wow, that's fantastic. Can we as Audicon go with you? And he's like, oh, why does an engineering company want to come with me? But by going with him on this journey, we were part of capturing the story of the public transport commuter in Africa. Because engineers, we sit in very fancy buildings and we design these public transport systems across the continent, sometimes with very little empathy for the end user. And so now by having these photographs, we can take these photographs to our engineers and say, these are the people you're designing for. More important, we take it to our clients and say, Mr. Client, we're not designing for you. These are the people we're designing for. And so it allows hardcore engineers to understand the end user in a very different way, and there's some emotional attachment to the end user through these photographs. And so this is just some of the photographs from Yasser's collection. And this girl was traveling with a mother and father and a baby brother, and they got off the train to stretch their legs. And they were going to a hospital. They needed to get the brother to hospital. And Yasser asked the father if he could take this photograph. And she couldn't take her eyes off the camera. And as he took the photograph, the father said, Zambian girl. And so this became the name of this photo. But behind this photo is the whole story of how dependent this family is on public transport to save this child's life. And so how public transport means something very differently for people in the rest of Africa compared to people like ourselves of privilege who can just get into our car. And this photograph capturing sort of the build up to peak hour traffic in Joburg, one of the stations in Joburg. Again, a journey that 85% of people in South Africa have to take every day. Engineers, we get in our cars and we go to work. And so we don't have to go through this every day. This story of a woman close to the Vic Falls who basically manufactures these reed brooms, and she makes it outside her house, and she needs to get the train to go get the rubber bands and things that she needs to make and load it in these bags and then take it back to her home. And this train is not designed for these bags. And so this is, every time she needs to take this journey, it's what we call a pain point, because the train is not designed for this purpose. And so when we do design thinking, we pick up these pain points and you try and design out the pain points for people. This is Omiyan, who's worked for the railways his whole life, and he's got the rail in his blood, and he's retired. But once you retire, you've got access to 2 free trips. So he was on his free trip up to Joburg, but he loves the railways. He loves rail. Like I said, it's in his blood. And then this guy, he manufactures and sells popcorn machines along the side of the road. And he was waiting for the bus to go into town to collect his spare parts for his popcorn machine. And so we see, that public transport means very different things to different people in Africa. And this story that Yasser relayed to me of this journey, he says, when he goes to London, because he's launched a book in Europe as well, he sits on London Underground, you make eye contact with someone, they will look away, they don't speak to you. You don't speak to strangers. And he says, yet he was sitting on a bus in the middle of nowhere on his way to Mozambique, and a complete stranger next to him, she opened up her lunch and she shared a lunch with him. And at that point, he says he realized that, for him, this was humanity. And because as Africans, we often make this mistake that we need to catch up with the West. And it's not about catching up with the West, it's a different story. We have our own stories to tell, our own narratives to tell. And so when we talk about the futures and innovation, it's not necessarily the technology. It's just building things in a different way. And so the challenge we give to our engineers is saying, these are the photographs of the end user now. Design the best public transport system you can, using technology, using innovation, but not losing the humanity in the system. And so it is about using creativity to bring that humanity, to bring that empathy into a hardcore engineering world to shape a better future. And so the question is, I've given you a long story about Audicon, and did it work? So we started this journey in 2016. In 2017, we entered this competition for the most innovative companies, and we ended up 5th from nowhere. No engineering companies ever been in. And you see the competition is in the form of Saatchi and Planet Innovation and media and marketing advertising companies. And so for the engineering company to end up fifth on this list was like this, people were blown away that the hardcore engineering company was able to get onto this list. But over the years, Oricon has continued on this journey. And last year, in the midst of a pandemic, it won the most innovative company for 2020. And again, this is what's possible. It doesn't matter which environment you are, how hardcore technical it is, you can bring innovation into your organization using these skills of the future, and you can be part of shaping and creating a different future if you have this vision of what this future can be. And so that's what Oricon has done extremely well. It's saying, what is the future we want to be part of creating, and now how do we get there? What skills do we need to get there? And this way of thinking and doing business is important for any industry. End up with this slide, which basically Oricon was involved with this building in Dubai, the tallest building in the world. And there's exactly a very good financial model behind this building, but won't touch on that now. But so Oricon, had the best tall building structural engineers working on this, and they asked the lead engineer on this project a few years ago at the conference, what's the most difficult thing he's dealing with on this building? And people were expecting him to talk about the sway of the building or the materials, because this building is 1 kilometer high. And he says, no, the most difficult thing he's dealing with on this building is that the lifts in this building is specially designed for it, because it's 1 kilometer high, so it needs to accelerate at massive speeds. And his biggest problem is, how do the people using the lift not get motion sickness? And so think about that. We have a structural engineer, world-class in his field. He now needs to speak to a medical field to understand motion sickness and how this is going to be overcome. And this is the future engineer. Because guess what? The analytics on this building and the technical things on this building, most of it has been done by artificial intelligence. But that applies to all industries. All industries are being rapidly disrupted. And so the future engineer, like the other future professionals, are going to be those that can think outside of the box, engage with people outside of the box, those that can be creative and have critical thinkers. And this is confirmed by organizations like the World Economic Forum that says the 3 key skill sets for the workers of 2030s: creativity, complexity, and critical thinking. And so I think in the space that you find yourself, you need to ask, how well are these skills embedded? If you want to be part of shaping the future and a better future, then these are the skills that you need. And lots of people are talking about it, and we need to act on it now. And our president picked up on this when you had the BRICS summit in South Africa. He also said the 3 most important skills for employed by 2020 would be complex problem solving, critical thinking, and creativity. Because if we don't get this right, if we get led by the technology, we will contribute towards inequality in our country. We need to get the human side right of the technology. So in conclusion, when you think about the future, remember, there's always more than one future. You cannot predict the future, but you can be part of shaping a better future. And what you need to do is bring this creative world into our corporate, technical world, government world, and be aware of creativity, understanding the end user, having deep empathy for the end user, understanding that these global problems, grand challenges are complex problems, and there's this feel of complexity out there. And if you embrace those things, you don't have to become specialist in, but be aware that they're out there, you will be able to navigate yourself into the future. I've spoken a lot. I'm going to open up to any questions. Okay, so there's a hand.
Yeah, June has a question, Abbas.
Yeah.
June, maybe you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can also show your face if you want to, as you ask the question.
Well, I'll stay blank. Thank you. I just wanted to ask you. I'm very frustrated by the slow pace with which education changes and moves in terms of creating equity for all the children in our country. And yet, for me, a single national strategy is also not the answer, because you were talking very much about the end user, and our end user is going to differ in different communities, different provinces, if we look at things like that. So how do we kind of break away from this whole single national strategy in education?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I was just reading an article recently around this whole concept of centralized versus decentralized.
Yes.
Yeah, so firstly, during a pandemic and crisis, the decentralized model seems to work better, and there's evidence to prove that as far as numbers within corporations and those sort of things, because you allow people to do what they need to do. I think with regard to education, and I'm working quite closely with UCT and a number of other educational institutions as well, it's extremely complex problem. So definitely we're dealing with complexity when we talk about education in South Africa. And this concept of decentralized, and I spoke about moving from designing for people to designing with people and design by the people. That culture is not going to happen overnight, because people want to hold on to this centralized control of everything. The government department case study that I'll be covering tomorrow gives you an indication of the journey that department is on in getting this right. As far as saying, it's not about us, our engineers and our architects designing things constantly. We need to actually engage with stakeholders in a very different way. And I'm not talking about the very well-regulated community participation in South Africa. That's fairly well-regulated, but it's after the event. Someone has already made a decision what's going to happen. So we're talking about how do you actually empower communities in a very different way. Like I said, design thinking is not the silver bullet for everything, but what it does, it brings that empathy into the organization, because you need to create the culture within government that will allow you to come with that discussion. Right, so that's what we're doing. We're working with government, creating fertile ground for people to bring innovative ideas. So now, if you go to Department of Transport in Public Works and talk about this concept of human centricity, talk about shaping the future, they will actually listen to you. Had you gone there 2 years ago, we wouldn't have even landed. And so it's critical that we create fertile ground for these discussions to happen, because these complex problems can't be solved with just putting another system in place. It's not going to be solved that way. You need to create a culture within institution, and specifically decision-making institution, that says, how do we bring the end user into our strategy, into our planning, of what we do.
Yeah, so it's almost like communities would perhaps have a better opportunity of doing this if they could design for their community, and I'm thinking of parents being involved, rather than some high power somewhere saying this is how that it needs to devolve, and as you were saying. Thank you.
Emma posed the question, do you think that design thinking or something similar should be taught in primary high schools? Absolutely. Design thinking, you can Google it. There's a lot out there. You're not going to learn anything from Googling it. Design thinking is one of those things you need to live and experience. And it's a fun exercise. It's a fun experience. And so kids love it. When you take kids through it, they just love it. But it allows children to think in a very different way once they've been exposed to design thinking. And so, we definitely, through Open Design Festival, we're working with Sunay, who comes from the primary education space, looking at how do we do that as well, bringing design thinking. Design thinking is still fairly new in South Africa, although overseas in the West it's fairly well established. In South Africa, it's still fairly new. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to take the concepts of design thinking, put an African lens onto it, and implement it into primary schools. I'm a big supporter of that. And anyone here that can assist with that, be happy to chat to you. June, you've got your hand up.
June, I think you forgot to put your hand down. Have you got another question? Oh, she's taken it down. There's
Okay.
another comment. Roger Martin, Abbas, have you seen it? Roger
Yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, we know Roger Martin's work, and definitely, you know, it's a similar sort of thing as far as testing this in primary school. So the whole design thinking methodology, it's very intuitive and it's very inquisitive, and we were all inquisitive, right? When we were 4-year-olds, we were all asking why. You constantly ask your parents why, until they tell you because I say so. And then that inquisitiveness gets beaten out of you as you progress. By the time you get to work, you're not inquisitive anymore. It's almost seen as taboo. And so design thinking comes in and tries to unlock that inquisitiveness again. It tries to unlock that 4-year-old in you. And so that's why, you know, we run design sessions with top executives in this country, and there's Lego and there's painting and you drawing, and initially when people come in there, you can see the resistance, but you know, once you take them through the process and they see actual outcomes using this approach, they're just blown away. So it is about unlocking the 4-year-old in you, and bringing that culture back into organizations.
Question.
Okay, someone asked on the running a course on the subject. Yeah, so we are as part of the whole change at UCT. The summer school actually looked at where is UCT going and how does it contribute towards these skills of the future. And so they've tied up with a doctor in complexity. He's been practicing applied complexity for the last 20 years. And what he's done is taken this 20 years of experience and put it into, I don't want to say an app, it's an online learning platform. And so everything of this program is using the science of complexity, from the colors to the questions to how it's laid out. And as you answer the question, the system will see if you answered it correctly. If you answered it wrong, it will bring back the question later on. It sees how long you take to answer. And it's basically a self-learning course that you will be able to go on in this field of complexity. So that will be piloted, I think, within the next few weeks. We're hoping to launch that. So that will be through summer school. You'll be able to find it from some, but I'll show you some of the stuff tomorrow of what that thing can potentially is possibly going to look like. And I know when I spoke to Mehdi from summer schools, we're looking at people who attended this lecture will be able to get a discount for that course when it is launched. So I think, yeah, just keep in contact with the summer school, but I'll give some more information on that tomorrow as well. So, yeah,
Richard has a